Now it's kind of like like you said, it's a 2-book series, which is, we're kind of unusual in the fantasy world. Most everyone goes for trilogies or quadrilogies or something even longer. So why 2 books instead of 3?
Well, it's an artifact actually of when I first had my first book contract. I was originally with Simon and Schuster, and the book that I sold them, the editor there felt that the book would be better as 2 books. That was sort of had a double arc to it, and if I could divide them in half, then make the first half into one book and the second half into another book, that this would be a good thing. However, that didn't really come to pass. I took the first half and I expanded it and made it its own book, but then she left Simon & Schuster, and I was an orphan. And so then when I went over to Random House is my second publisher on this, that was an artifact of the first contract, that I was under contract for 2 books. And so the editor there felt like we could work with it, and the first book kind of takes us from peace to war, and the second book takes us from war back to peace, and it could be kind of, balanced that way. And in fact, here's another little bit of trivia, which is that original split, that first book that I'd written, my editor at Random House was not that into it. He wanted the second book, so I wrote the second book. So Serafina is actually the second half of what it originally was. The first half was her at home being unhappy. The second half was her leaving home. So then I had this other book to write, and what?
Oh.
Nothing. No one knows. It could have been anything. So it took me a little while to find my feet on that, but I did. And so, yeah.
Did you find a challenge if you're having 2 halves? Because, sort of the cliche with dramatic beats is the 3-beat structure, where you start low, you go high, you end low, or you start high, you go low, you end high.
Right.
And so did you find it challenging to be working more with a 2-beat structure, at least in terms of the books?
It was a challenge, but actually, I feel like the way I solved it is to make them into 2 very different books. So they are all Serafina's story, but I think the first book kind of stands alone, and the second book kind of also stands alone.
So did you find that the writing process for the second book was, different? Did you take a different approach for the second book compared with the first one?
The writing for the second book, it turned out very odd how it went, just because Serafina took 9 years altogether, and I rewrote it 4 times with 4 different plots. So by the time it came out, I was burned out.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was like, oh, I gotta write this other book now. Ooh. And so I actually started the book almost with my eyes closed. Like I was just like, okay, I'm gonna write, and I didn't want to be there for it.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes any sense. I was so just burned out, and so I didn't want to be present. And so it turns out you could write an entire draft like that. No.
But was it any good?
No. And my editor was all like, oh, he's a very polite person. He was like, oh, well, that's a start. Thanks. Yeah, okay. So I actually, in the middle of this, I had to take some time and figure out how to enjoy writing again, because I was just burnt. I really was. And so what I did is I took a month off, where I said to my editor and my agent both, I said, look, I'm in a bad place. I'm depressed. I need, and so they're like, take your time, all the time you need, please, take care of yourself, which was good. So I took a month and I rode my bike. That was one thing I did.
Mm-hmm.
And I took up singing was the other thing. Because what I figured out finally, well, A, exercise always helps, right?
Yeah.
But B, I needed a different art that I could do without all the pressure, without all the ego attached to it. Something I could just enjoy, that nobody cared if I was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't thousands of people I could disappoint.
Mm-hmm.
So singing became that for me. And, I would sing, and then that would help me get back into the right mind space to write. That I would have the joy of music, basically, and then it would remind me what it was supposed to feel like, ideally, to write, and then I could kind of get back to it. But it was tough there for a while. It was. But that became my process. Became making sure that I was singing, and if writing started to hurt, I would back off and say, whatever, I'm going to go sing, and then I would.
Well, and it's hard, isn't it, going from that shift from the first book where you're writing it for your own pleasure, it's a hobby in a lot of cases, to then doing it professionally or semi-professionally, and all of a sudden you know that there are these expectations from readers from the first book, and
Right.
there's an audience. You're performing for an audience that wasn't there in the first
Right.
place. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I found making that shift difficult for a lot of the same reasons you just said as well.
Well, yeah, and also in that is that writing, at least when I started doing it, was sort of a therapy for me, you know, and I think that is for a lot of writers. It sort of helps you sort your thoughts out and get yourself into a good place with life. Suddenly it was the source of stress. And so it was like, wait, I don't have a thing to de-stress me anymore. And so that was hard. But again, I finally got to where I was enjoying it. And now I feel like I am in a good place. I'm actually working on another book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Also fantasy?
Set in the same world. It's a story of one of Seraphina's half-sisters who we meet very briefly. So it's going to be exciting. I'm happy, and I'm just having fun doing it. And so this is completely different than what Shadowscale was. So
I think, there's a fine line with writing where on one hand you need to be disciplined enough to finish a large book, which means that sometimes you have to write when you don't always feel 100% like writing. And yet at the same time, if it's always feeling like this grind or something you don't entirely want to do, it turns out horribly. So that first draft of yours, how much of that ended up in the final book, or did you basically start from scratch again?
A lot of it did end up in the final book, but in sort of a different form. One thing that happened in all this singing is that I found a good analogy for myself. And I'm going to tell you this, and it's not going to make any sense, and you can just smile and nod, okay? But in the moment, it made a lot of sense. I was singing in these two choirs, but I was also teaching myself overtone singing. And in overtone singing, the idea is that you split your voice. All the tones the harmonics are all in your voice already, but you kind of redirect your voice through your nose, and it splits into the what's called the fundamental, which is the main note you're singing, and then the overtone, which comes through your nose. And so what I realized learning overtone singing was, I have mistaken the fundamental. This made sense to me. And so what I have as the fundamental of this book, what I think the book is about, is really just an overtone. And the book is really about something else that's below it, that I need to bring that out. And so that, I called my editor. I actually called him on the phone. I never call him. I always email. But I called him on the phone. I was like, Jim, I figured it out. And I told him this, and he was like, well, you sound really enthusiastic. That's great. Do it. So I was like, okay, yes, I promise it makes sense. I promise.
Well, a lot of times I think you have to write a version of the story or write a good chunk of the story before you really do realize what the story is actually about.
Right.
You have all those preconceived notions setting out, but then when you see how it actually plays out, you go, oh, that element is actually the theme of the story.
And I think that's what it was, said in more simple terms that people can understand that aren't going through your nose. But yeah, right. I thought it was this thin note, and it was really the fuller note down here that I wasn't quite hearing. So, yeah.
I think that's a beautiful analogy.
Oh, thank you.
So one last question: have you read anything recently that you would recommend?
Sure.
Or any good books on the horizon?
The Story of Owen is a big one, which I read for the Morris Award interviews. Since previous Morris Award winners interview the current crop of nominees, and so she was the one that I chose. And I read that, and that was really fun because that book is also dragons and music, and she's Canadian. And so it was like, ooh, this is exciting. It'll be exactly like my book. And it was nothing like my book, and it was wonderful. So it's set in the sort of our modern world here, but dragons exist. But they're very they're completely opposite of my dragons. They're just like big monster dinosaur things that aren't particularly intelligent. But they get high on carbon emissions. And so they're always, like, if you drive along, they're all like, and they're coming at you. It's great. So that was super good fun. Another one that I enjoyed that I took me completely by surprise. I read the crossover, which just won the Newbery Award, and this was given to me. I can't even remember why, but it's a verse novel. It's middle grade. It's a verse novel about basketball, and I was kind of like, I don't like basketball, and verse novels, whatever. But I started reading, and it just took me by surprise. It was so, I don't know, full of heart. I don't know how to explain. It was moving. And what was really interesting to me was how efficient you have to be when you're writing a verse novel to get all the characterization in and get all the action and all of that is in there, but in so few words relative to what a novel usually is. And so that kind of blew my tiny mind. And I enjoyed it a lot.
Do you feel like musical training helps with writing stuff like verse or just lyrical prose in general?
I think it does. I think it does because you have a sense of rhythm. And I think rhythm for me is the main thing. I'm a little old fashioned about poetry. I don't like really just, blank, not even blank verse has rhythm, but free verse usually I don't go for that very much. I like it to have a meter. And I like writing stuff with a meter because it's like a puzzle, right?
So with your second book coming out, do you feel like now that you're, officially, you really, truly an author?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, that'll work.
Well, this has been a real, real pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been good fun.
Well, from Montana, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for watching us, and thank you, Rachel, for appearing in the interview.
Thank you for having me.
I can't wait to read Shadow Scale, and I'm sure all of your fans will feel the same way.
Thank you.